Mr. President, I have been coming to the Senate floor just about every day that we have been in session so far this year, and I'm going to continue to do so, and talk about what I believe is our most pressing crisis that this body faces and that our country faces. And that is the uncontrolled runaway federal spending and accumulating debt, and how it is both dragging our economy down and how it threatens to provoke a major economic disaster if it's not addressed. In previous remarks that I've made on this floor, I tried to make the point that if we fail to get federal spending under control in the short term, our economy will remain and continue to remain in the doldrums because of this cloud of economic uncertainty that hangs over investors, business people, and consumers. But I don't want my colleagues to just take my word for it. A host of experts, commentators, business people, and investors around the country and, frankly, around the world, people from both sides of the political spectrum, have been and will continue to make this same point. And the message they make is this: unless Washington stops punting this problem and begins to demonstrate the will to cut spending in serious ways to reduce our long-term debt, the economy will continue to limp along. Investors will continue to remain on the sidelines. Business owners will continue not to hire new employees. And we will hasten the day when investors lose confidence in the United States as a worthy credit risk. And I know that the market has responded in a favorable way. I hope that continues. But the fundamentals underlying our current economy don't justify that continuing far into the future. So today I'd like to quote from what others are saying, and not just what a senator from Indiana believes and has been saying on this floor. And I want to talk about what they're saying about our debt and spending crisis. First, I believe we can all agree, or most of us can agree in this fact, that the first and the most essential function of the United States government is to defend and protect its citizens from the threats to their national security. As our national debt continues to rise unrestrained, we're putting our children's future and our country's future in a very vulnerable state. Perhaps the most dire and frightening warning has come from one of our nation's highest-ranking officials, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, who said, and I quote, "The continually increasing debt is the biggest threat we have to our national security." Not al-Qaeda, not suicide bombers, not Islamic fundamentalists. The biggest threat, he said, facing our national security, according to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, someone who's made a career leading our country through tumultuous battles and war, the largest threat is our very own red ink. Erskine Bowles, former White House Chief of Staff to President Bill Clinton, also recognizes the imperative need to address our spending and debt crisis. As we all know, Bowles was tapped by President Obama to lead a bipartisan deficit commission with former Republican Senator Alan Simpson. The two men, along with the commission, proposed recommendations for a big and bold plan to reduce our long-term debt. Rather than heed some of these recommendations and build off of this bipartisan momentum several years ago, the President ignored it completely and since has done nothing and offered no plan of his own to fix our dire fiscal plight, other than to propose new taxes. As I mentioned in previous remarks, the President got his tax increases on millionaires and billionaires, but no one should be fooled into thinking that this solves our fiscal crisis. Recently, in an interview, former Chief of Staff Erskine Bowles rightfully criticized the administration and the Congress for not striking a significant budget deal and called it that failure the most disappointing thing in my life. He went on to say, "They're bouncing from one crisis to another. It's nuts We have an enormous fiscal problem in this country. We've got to put our big boy and big girl pants on and go to work. And he added, the problems are real, the solution's painful, and there's no easy way out. Finally, he said, we've got to do stuff that's real. I mean, there's no sense in, just working at the edges. If we don't slow the rate of growth in healthcare programs, Bowles said, it's going to eat up the entire budget and virtually bankrupt the country. The warning signs and the calls for action are coming from all sectors. From the business sector, Gary Loveman, chairman of the Business Roundtable's Health and Retirement Committee, said the following, and I quote, keeping the U.S. economy from careening over the fiscal cliff was a first step, but our elected leaders must not stop there. Although economic recovery has been stalled, renewed expansion is possible if conditions are set in a comprehensive budget agreement that includes entitlement reform and long-term changes to reduce deficits. In this way, he said, we will ensure the viability of the health and retirement safety net for future generations of Americans. John Malden, president of Millennium Wave Advisors, an investment advisory firm and publisher of Malden Economics and author of Endgame, a book many of us have heard about and read, said this, the real issue is the deficit. The leaders of both parties recognize that the current path spelled out on our fiscal balance sheet is unsustainable. The deficit must be brought under control, or we will find ourselves all too soon in the situation now facing much of Europe and Japan. The options at that point become far more dire. And a business owner in my home state of Indiana also recognizing these dangers, and I think he reflects the sentiment of virtually every business person I've talked to over the past 2 years. Rick Zare, a business owner in Fort Wayne, Indiana, said, we all need to manage our income and not borrow beyond what we afford. I look at our country's deficit spending, and it's so far beyond what the rest of us have to live like every day. As a business owner, it makes me nervous. Everyone is paying for deficit spending. Economists are sounding the alarm as well. Kenneth Rogoff, a respected Harvard economist, said, the idea that one should just ignore all these problems and apply crude Keynesian stimulus is a dangerous one. It matters a great deal how the government taxes and spends, not just how much. The U.S. debt level is a constraint, he said. A growing number of empirical studies, including my own joint work with Carmen Reinhart, suggests that the U.S. has already reached a debt level that has been associated with slower growth in advanced countries. And our credit rating agencies have also weighed in. These warnings alone should be enough to urge Congress and the administration to act. According to the U.S. Treasury Department's fiscal or financial report of the U.S. government for fiscal year 2012, and I quote this, while these projections are subject to considerable uncertainty, the debt to GDP ratio would continue to rise unsustainably under current policy. Can I state that again? Our own U.S. Treasury report said that unless these projections are subject to considerable, or while these projections are subject to considerable uncertainty, the Treasury report says the debt to GDP ratio will continue to rise unsustainably under current policy. Does that not suggest to us that current policy is not working? When the U.S. Treasury puts out a report saying what you're doing here in the Congress is unsustainable. Unless you grasp the reality of what is happening with our spending and our debt, we are headed for a crisis if we're not in one already. When Standard & Poor's downgraded the U.S. federal government debt in August of 2011, they said our lowering of the rating was prompted by our view on the rising public debt and our perception of greater policy-making uncertainty. There's that word again, uncertainty. There's that implication again, failure to take action. Mr. President, the time to act is now. We can no longer sit back and hope that this problem is going to go away. Too many people want to just think that, well, if we just sort of stumble along the way we're stumbling along, it's all going to work itself out. We can no longer and should no longer accept double-digit unemployment. And yes, I said double-digit. While the official number is hovering around 8%, we all know that millions of Americans have given up looking for work. Millions of others have dropped out of the employment lines, and that the numbers are far higher, and the distress is far greater than what is admitted. This is not a new problem. It's been long recognized even by the President. 4 years ago, in February 2009, President Obama held a fiscal responsibility summit, and here's what he said. And that's why today, in 2009, February of 2009, the President said, and that's why today I'm pledging to cut the deficit we inherited in half by the end of my first term in office. This will not be easy, he said. It will require us to make difficult decisions and face challenges we've long neglected. But I refuse to leave our children with a debt that they cannot repay. And that means taking responsibility right now, in this administration, for getting our spending under control. But here we are, Mr. President, 4 years from those remarks. 4 years where the President's own bipartisan deficit commission was dismissed. 4 years from the time when he pledged to the American people he would cut the deficit in half. 4 years from the time when he said responsibility needs to be taken now. And Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent for 3 more minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, thank you. 4 years from making these statements, here we are, where we have added trillions of dollars of new debt, the greatest increase in the history of America. And we have ignored and pushed down the road spending without a real budget proposal or a long-term deficit plan. Experts and economists from both sides of the aisle agree that spending reductions must be a part of the equation to address our dangerous debt. The President has called for a balanced approach, but has shown no signs of leadership on restructuring runaway mandatory spending. Even the Washington Post editorial board acknowledged this in a piece just recently on November 27th, and I quote, not necessarily a conservative editorial board. Elections do have consequences, and Mr. Obama ran on a clear platform of increasing taxes on the wealthy. But he was clear on something else also. Deficit reduction must be balanced, including spending cuts as well as tax increases. Since 60% of the federal budget goes to entitlement programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, there's no way to achieve balance without slowing the rate of growth in those programs. So in conclusion, Mr. President, let me say this. There is a widespread consensus about the seriousness of this problem and the fact that we must take significant measures to rein in our deficit spending and do it now. We need a bold plan that will reduce spending, reform and simplify our tax system, and most of all, restructure Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security to preserve those benefits for future generations. In subsequent remarks, I intend to address how Congress can get with it and become part of the solution instead of part of the problem, and create a long-term deficit reduction plan. That begins, Mr. President, by fulfilling our obligation, our constitutional obligation, to pass a budget, which this body has not done in more than 1,300 days. But let's be honest with ourselves. This will only happen if we, the United States Senate, summon the political courage and the will to engage in direct, good faith, bipartisan efforts to deal with our nation's #1 challenge. Perhaps Alice Rivlin, budget director under President Bill Clinton, summed it up best. There's no mystery about what we ought to do. We just need to get on with it. Mr. President, my Senate colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, let's get on with it. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator